Let me begin with an explanation of linguistic ideologies with a fairly simple and accessible example. This example, which to most people seems commonsensical um, and benign at worst, and highly positive at best, turns out to be deeply implicated in the culture of white racism in the United States. Famous linguistic anthropologist Michael Silverstein refers to this ideology as monoglot standard, the emergence of standard languages and or so-called standard languages, and the ideologies that have preserved them, and in some cases made them even the objects of legislation and intense government involvement around the world during the last several hundred years. Now, this is a long and complex topic that goes beyond the scope of the lecture, but I can summarize the major elements of the ideology of standards in the following way, in about 4 points. The first part of the ideology of standard is that the belief that if there are two or more variants of a form, only one is correct. So this contrasts with the view of linguists that all varieties of human languages are systematic and rule-governed. So for linguists, correctness is a social and political, not a grammatical fact. The second part of the ideology is the belief that ways of speaking can be ranked according to their prestige. So prestige and correctness go together in the ideology of standard because it's believed that prestigious people speak the prestigious form, which deserves its prestige because it's correct. Again, the ranking of ways of speaking according to prestige is of interest to linguists as a social phenomena, but it's considered to be a strictly arbitrary result of politics and history. Linguists haven't been able to identify any scientific grounds for such judgments, and they're very fond of sharing a huge repertoire of examples of how a single linguistic feature will have high prestige in one circumstance and low in another. So a third part of the ideology is that a standard, so-called standard, will be endowed with a respectable history and a set of arguments that explain why its prestige is incorrect. Now, such popular histories are nearly always rather different from what careful historical scholarship reveals. And finally, believers in the ideology of standard hold that to speak the correct and prestigious form will bring social and economic benefits. So it's important, as well as possible and desirable, for people to learn to speak this way. Now, not to acquire the standard is considered a sign of moral failing, or at least an absence of proper ambition. So sociolinguistic study, however, shows that even absolute control over a standard, so-called standard variety, often does not bring economic or social benefits if a speaker is otherwise stigmatized. And the study of race and gender discrimination is crowded with examples. So we can look at how the ideology of standard works and how it's entwined with white racism by starting with a belief about correctness that is shared very widely by white speakers of American English. And it's this, that double negatives are incorrect. People who hold this view, that double negatives are incorrect, rationalize it by explaining that since, two negatives make a positive, like as in multiplication in arithmetic, sentences with double negatives make no sense and are ruled out by universal logic. So speakers who use double negatives are not only incorrect, they're illogical. So they'll be unable to coherently represent and communicate their ideas and will be held back from success in their endeavors. But because they can't see their illogic, they're probably unintelligent. So while believing that double negatives are incorrect may seem harmless enough, as soon as this belief is used to sort people according to communicative and intellectual, and as we'll see, moral potential, it is revealed as less benign. And I can make this example clearer by looking more closely at the grammars of negatives and the ways that they're distributed across the English-speaking world. So a nice example of double negative usage was uttered once by a young African-American man who kept homing pigeons in coops on the roof of his apartment building in New York City and was proud of his provisions for their security. So he was quoted by the sociolinguistic who was studying how he used language by saying the following: It ain't no cat can't get in no coop." Now, linguists call the grammatical principle that organizes this sentence as something called negative concord. So in strict negative concord, if a negative appears anywhere in a sentence, all other negatable elements must also be negative. Now, the variety of American English that William Labov, who was the researcher who did this, labeled African American English vernacular, follows that principle. Most white working class speakers in the United States also use negative concord. Negative concord is a staple of the grammar of some important popular genres of musical lyrics, like rap music and country music, and it appears in representations of working class speech in films, television, and theater. Now, in contrast, most middle class speakers of all colors throughout the English-speaking world use varieties of English that exhibit something called negative polarity. And with negative polarity, only one negative can appear in a sentence. So if I kept my pigeons on my roof, I would say there isn't any cat that can get into my coop. Or no cat can get into my coop. But so every element that follows the first negative must be positive or polar to the negative. So most English speakers know how to utter sentences with negative concord. Let me start this again. Know that to utter sentences with negative concord exposes speakers to stigma, to be labeled as crude or uneducated. Now, the association between negative concord and social subordination is so strong that many people are often surprised when they're reminded that Spanish, which they acknowledge to be an important world language, uses negative concord even at its highest registers. On the other hand, Cupeño, an Aztecan language that was spoken by a small group of hunters and gatherers in Aboriginal California, exhibits rigid negative polarity, kind of like the classiest forms of English. So both types of negative grammar are possible, and neither type has any inherent connection with logic or education or class. However, English speakers all feel strongly that there is such an association. Middle class speakers think that African American or white working class speakers who use negative concord are just doing something non-standard. They're speaking illogically, revealing the poverty and disorder of their thought. So this piece of linguistic ideology permits its adherents to hear anew, in sentence after sentence, evidence of the inferiority of those who use double negatives, and evidence as well as of their own superior intelligence and cultivation, which justifies their access to the resources that middle class brings them. It's important to understand that the double negative in English doesn't work because people carefully reason through the two negatives make a positive argument. This is we call an ex post facto rationalization. It works at a gut level, and to use a double negative without wrapping it in vivid and unmistakable oral or even gestural quotation marks, right, as when a middle-class person quotes a country music or hip-hop lyric, would bring instant discredit. Kind of, the ideology of standard and the subpart of it that stigmatizes double negatives meets resistance. One of the reasons that double negatives are so common in song lyrics is that for working class people, the kind of grammar in which they are embedded can be a proud emblem of personal authenticity, of being unpretentious, kind of egalitarian, and even more specifically of being authentically masculine. Using this kind of language in hip-hop culture centered in the African American community is part of the expression keeping it real, speaking the truth about life and its circumstances. Double negatives appear in the representation of African American and working class characters in films, television, and theater, literature, because such characters wouldn't seem real to viewers and readers if they didn't exhibit that usage. So in domains where authentic masculinity is especially at stake, double negatives may be crucial in identity work. Male athletes, even white men known to have tertiary degrees from prestigious institutions, might feel constrained to speak in this working class style, even in the relatively formal context of interviews on radio or television, lest their masculinity be doubted. But the potential for stigma is always present when such uses are advanced, and the stigma is especially acute when the speaker is African American.